Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 3 game from the Luneberg Chess Festival. Now, if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I drew a really tough game with black against Evgeny Vorobiev, and I was hoping to play a little bit better in this one because essentially I was pretty much lost and got away with one, and you don't want to be skating on thin ice like that all the time. So anyways, without further ado, in this one, I was white and playing a FIDE master by the name of Ruben Koellner, a young German player. And yeah, it would be a tough challenge, so let's get into it. So anyways, I opened with d4, which is typical for me most days. And after d4, Ruben actually played knight f6. And I wasn't actually quite sure what he'd go for. I saw he played some Nimzo stuff, some Queen's Gambit Decline stuff, so I really could not pinpoint exactly what he was going to trot out, and I just was going to try and remain flexible and wait and see. I went knight f3 for that purpose. Typically, if you play knight f3 before going for c4, you can, employ a few more setups than you would if you went directly with c4, so that's why I opted for this particular move order. And now Ruben actually went e6. And again, I wasn't sure what he'd play. I didn't know if it'd be Queen's Gambit Declined or Nimzo, or so I just was continuing with my moves. And here I actually went g3. And basically my reason for playing g3 here is a lot of players now, particularly at the between the 2200 and 2500 level, love to play bishop b4 check lines against the Catalan or just c4 right away. And so, for instance, if I go c4, d5, and then g3, bishop b4 check is extremely topical. The idea is that when you play bishop d2 to block, now the bishop returns to e7, and the argument is that the one on d2 is actually a little bit misplaced. And so I didn't want to essentially play this system that has been played thousands of times and really is been trotted out and is well known. I tend to like to go for paths that are a little less popular than the main trodden lines. So anyways, instead of going for c4 and allowing this bishop b4 check stuff to happen as a possibility, I actually went for g3. And this was an over-the-board concept, but the gist is that now bishop b4 check is kind of ineffective because I can just block with c3. So, yeah. So anyways, after g3, black went d5, and now I went bishop g2, continuing in the same vein to not allow this bishop b4 check resource. And here I thought we'd probably transpose to Catalan with him playing bishop e7. So if he did go bishop e7, I could castle, and then black could castle. And now I could go c4, and note that, again, I didn't allow that intermediate check, that specific variation with bishop d2. So that's kind of what I was angling for, ultimately going to a Catalan position. But in this position, he actually played something that I'd never faced over the board, and it's actually quite original. It's not super popular in these setups, but it is entirely justified. And it's actually the move b5. And this is actually a rare guest in tournaments, but it's employed by some players, some grandmasters. I think Georg, I'm mispronouncing his name, but George Meyer, Gorg Meyer, however you pronounce that guy's name, that grandmaster from Germany, he's actually been a proponent of this b5 stuff. I can actually recall a game he played against Paco Vallejo with black at the what tournament was it? The Grinky Chess Classic, actually. I believe Meyer had a comfortable draw with black in this line with b5. And essentially the idea is that if the d4 or knight f3 ready type of player is not actually committing to playing c4 himself, well, the argument is that black's actually going to try and command that square. So there's actually quite a bit of logic to it, because you can see now c4 just actually hangs a pawn. So that's the strength of the move. The downside is that there might be some weaknesses you have by pushing the pawn too quickly. Specifically, you can look at the squares adjacent. A5 and c5 are a little bit more sensitive after the b5 move. And at some point, if I'm able to open up this diagonal, that also would be advantageous for white, because now there's not as much coverage on the light squares b7 and c6. So already here I'm thinking about ways in which I could play c4 to kind of liberate the structure and open up my diagonal. But it was actually a little bit complicated. I didn't jump in for that right away, obviously. So instead, I actually castled, kind of not committing to doing anything with this b5 move, challenging the pawn anyway. I just thought castling is reasonable, and then I'll figure it out next. So anyways, after castling, black played knight bd7. This is normal. And here actually is where there's a divergence in choices because each choice kind of has different implications for the position. And all of them revolve around trying to open up the position because white's already castled, black isn't. So white now can begin trying to undermine the center, chip away at black's solid foothold in the middle of the board. And one way you can actually do that is by playing the move a4. This is actually the most popular move in the database from this position. I didn't actually go for this, but the concept is that b4 is pretty much obligatory. You can't go a6 because after a b5, the rook on a8 is hanging, so that's not impossible. That's not possible. And if you go c6, that's a little bit awkward because white can go a takes b5 at any moment and actually open the A line for his rook. So really advisable to go b4 and release the tension because it's actually too much to bear. And after b4, white has actually gone c4 in this position quite a bit. And again, the point is trying to chip away at this diagonal. Now, I'm not too sure, how great this is for white. I mean, white could face en passant by black, b takes c3, and I would assume maybe knight takes c3 is the move, but an argument could be made that black is not doing so badly if he is actually able to get in c5 and liberate his backward pawn, and then he would have a central pawn majority in the center. So I'm not entirely sure about this variation, but it is another choice. Another idea would actually be to go knight fd2. Very, very unusual. I didn't see this move so much in the database, but the computer was showing it. And the idea is actually to play e4 and just liberate the bishop on the diagonal that way. And note knight fd2 is the move because now the bishop is actually reinforcing the square as well. I didn't, again, wind up going for this either, but it's just another interesting way to play. The move I played was actually b3. I thought it made a lot of sense to go for c4 and have it supported by the b-pawn, and I wasn't really concerned with black capturing twice on c4 because then my bishop would be unleashed. So for instance, if a move like bishop e7 was played, I thought c4 here is fully justified because a position like this, where black captures twice, would pretty much be lost because of knight e5. And note that not only is the bishop hitting the rook on a8, but also the knight is coming to c6, threatening to actually trap the black queen on d8. So those are kind of the dangers of the positioning opening up before black is actually ready. So anyways, after b3, black actually played a very, very good move, and one that I honestly did not really strongly consider, and it was actually the move bishop b7. And for some reason, I just didn't really think about this too much, but it's actually quite effective to kind of challenge the bishop on g2 on the diagonal. And really, it's in conjunction with the next move that kind of went over my head a little bit, because already now I probably should consider thinking about playing the move c4, and we'll see why in a moment. So anyways, after bishop d7, now I went knight bd2, trying to prepare the c4 break. Again, I probably could have gone away with playing c4 right away, because even if black takes a few times, it's very unlikely he's going to hang on to the c4 pawn, being that it's doubled. I probably could scoop it up with knight a3 to knight c4, and even from c4, I might actually have knight a5 challenging the bishop on b7. So this might actually have been a way for white to play. Also, rook b1 comes into play with the b file being open. But for some reason, I thought maybe things would be oversimplified here. A lot of pawns are coming off the board. Maybe there wouldn't be enough life in the position. And so I actually went knight bd2 because I thought, you know what, I don't want to actually play c4 as a gambit. I want to be able to recapture with my knight. And essentially, I just missed black's next move, which is actually very, very good and really causes me some problems. And it's the move b4. And essentially, the issue with b4 now is that I actually can't play c4 because en passant is a move, and essentially I don't get this privilege of playing the c4 break, which is what I was striving for the whole time. So essentially, this is a step in the wrong direction, this knight bd2 move that I made, because if I don't get in c4 and black comfortably gets in the c5 break, black can even be a little bit better just having the space advantage, and with the bishop being cut down on the diagonal by the black pawn, specifically on d5 and e6. It's very important that I liberate my fianchettoed bishop. Otherwise, it's not a particularly decent asset. So very, very tough position now, just dealing with the b4 move. So anyways, after b4, I realized that I should try and liberate my c2 pawn, so I actually played the move a3, trying to undermine the b4 pawn. And essentially, in a dream scenario, black would take on a3, and then that would give me the time to play c4. Note that the pawn on a3 isn't going anywhere, so almost like in the style of a Benko gambit, I don't have to rush to take it right away, and I can actually press forward in the middle. So this was definitely something that I was angling for, but of course I knew it was unlikely my opponent would release the tension, particularly when he's stopping the c4 move. So why take on a3? And after a3, Ruben actually decided to play a5. Again, very, very sensible move, makes a lot of sense, keeping the c pawn backward. And again, if the c pawn is backward for an extended period of time, white really does not have any advantage, and is quite frankly in danger of being worse, because if black manages to castle, develop his piece as castle and play c5, it's actually black that will have the space in this position. So I thought I had to act quick, and I was also very frustrated. Keep in mind, my opponent is a FIDE master, a little bit less than 2,300, and this is a game I should probably win. And if you saw round one, I lost my round one game against a 2280, so already not a great start for me, and I really, really was angling to win this game. So I actually took a few risks that were not wise, but you have to understand within the context of why I did it, which was I really wanted to win. So my next few moves could be questioned quite a bit, and I'll show you some reasonable alternatives to what black did, but keep that theme in mind. So anyways, after a5, I first played bishop b2, keeping the tension just for a moment and getting closer to connecting my rooks. But you can see the bishop on b2 is a really, really, ineffective piece as long as this diagonal is shut down. So I was hoping at some juncture that wouldn't be the case. So anyways, after bishop b2, black went bishop b7, developing. This is good. This makes sense. Again, if black castles and plays c5, he's going to be better. I now played knight e5, and this was, again, where I was talking about, maybe not the most correct move, but in the vein of being aggressive, I decided to go for it. And the reason this is not, necessarily a stellar move is because it's extremely risky. After knight takes e5 and d takes e5, it's really unclear whether that structure is actually good for me. Just to illustrate, knight takes e5 actually was played, but another line that would have actually just been totally fine for black was just castles. And the point is, again, if black castles and plays c5, he has no problems. And, I could take on b4 and go knight d3 to try and restrict the c5 move, but black can break on c5 anyway and get quite a decent position. But here, even the move queen c8 is effective, overprotecting the b7 bishop and then going for c5 in that particular line. So as long as black gets in the c5 move, I'm actually going to be in some trouble. And again, it all stems from the fact that my c-pawn is backward and weak. And if I actually liberate with the move c4 or c3, black will take en passant, and then my b3 pawn will be weak. So I basically have a pawn structure that's not particularly compact. And it is what it is. So anyways, I went for knight e5, and instead of castling, fortunately for me, black actually played knight takes e5, and this was kind of what I was looking for, because after d takes e5, even though my pawns are doubled here, my bishop on b2 has a little bit more scope than it did a move ago, and I thought there were some variations where maybe I'll get an e4 and undouble my pawns again, or actually just play f4, f5 and play for an attack on the king side. After d takes e5, black played knight d7, which makes a lot of sense, just essentially developing, redeploying the knight rather to the d7 square, and in some lines it might actually pop out to c5, but it's actually doing a fantastic job just eyeing the e5 pawn and actually supporting a c5 pawn break. So the knight on d7 is actually quite decently placed. And now I thought, you know what, again, I have to press onward with this plan. I have to justify these double pawns. So I went for the move a takes b4 first, just to release that tension. And after a takes b4, I went f4. And again, not the best move in the position, but my idea here was to entertain the move f5, or at least cause a bit of a crisis in black's position so that he'd have to be worried about that potential break. Now again, f5 is extremely risky and probably not very good because, I'm basically going for broke with, these two doubled e pawns, and it's really unlikely that my attack would, even work because black has the opportunity to trade one pair of rooks whenever he wants, and might even get a second pair of rooks if he, castles and gets the other rook to a8. So I wasn't super enthusiastic about this position, but it did at least give my opponent something to think about. Fortunately for me, Ruben actually did go wrong here. Much, much more effective, again, I sound like a broken record, but it's true, would have been the move castles. And the point is now, if I press onward with a move like f5, black can actually play bishop c5 check, force my king to h1, and then just take on f5, and there's no attack. After a move like rook takes f5, black can just play queen e7, and we can see here that, black's rooks are connected, which is great. Mine are split. Black has a better pawn structure. I have these doubled e-pawns. My king is considerably weaker with my f-pawn being a doubled e-pawn and my king on h1 lacking much security. And black would just have a massive advantage here. And my rook might even be tactically vulnerable on the f5 square. So direct attacks don't work. And if that's the case, then I kind of just have to turtle with a move like e3 or knight f3. And black would start to take over, making use of his wonderful-looking pawn chain after the move c5. I mean, look at that, that one singular pawn island. That's not something you see every day with 7 pawns, but very, very nice pawn chain. So after f4, though, instead of castling, Ruben actually played f5. And this is a move that seemed very suspicious to my eyes for a few reasons. First of all, you weaken the e6 pawn, right? So even though it seems like it's hard to get at now, it is a little bit sensitive. It cannot be supported by pawn again, and there might be some future where a knight is on d4 targeting that pawn, so it's a little bit suspect. The other thing is that with f5, you actually give white a potential hook. So even if I decide not to take en passant, there might be a future where white actually gets to go g4 and pry open the g-file with g4, king h1, rook g1, and get counterplay on the king side. And so it's just a little bit strange to push that pawn because you actually give you give white a target. And again, when you give your opponent targets, typically that's not a good thing because it's something for them to kind of hone in against. And the difference is in this position, I didn't have any, lever that I could really, chip away at without ruining my pawn structure. So that's why, castling would have been much more effective. Now, after f5, again, I did have a choice. I could decide to chip away with g4, or I could decide to redeploy my knight to d4. But ultimately, I thought, you know what? With this bishop on b2, I should try and increase the scope of that bishop as much as possible. And that's why I actually decided to take en passant. And the point was that however black takes, this bishop on b2 is much better than it was a move ago, now that that diagonal is actually open. And tactically, this actually is just a very good move for me. The other issue now for black is that this bishop on g2 is also going to be a little bit better and have more potential for scope because now e4 comes into play as a potential move. Whereas in previous positions, if let's say I castled, if I played e4 now, Black could even consider playing d4 and shutting down this diagonal because f5 would always hang a pawn to knight takes e5. So for instance, let's say bishop c5 check, king h1, and d4. And essentially we have a scenario where, again, f5 just hangs the e5 pawn, and black has a nice little clamp on the queen side. So anyways, after f4, f5, en passant, bishop takes f6 was played. Makes sense. You want to try and challenge the bishop on the diagonal. But now the pawn structure has changed into a favorable scenario for me, where this pawn on e6 is now a backward pawn and a target. And black now actually looks to have 3 pawn islands, potentially 2 if he manages to play c5 and connect these pawns, but really looks like 3 right now, whereas a move ago he actually had 1 island. So it's amazing how the transformation in pawn structure drastically changes the evaluation, because now I have pieces to play against. So after bishop takes f6, I played bishop takes. Again, the bishop was challenged on that diagonal now. And after queen takes f6, I went rook takes a8. And you might say, why are you beginning these trading operations? Well, there's a very, very specific idea. After bishop takes a8, I played the very, very nice looking and aesthetic queen a1. And the idea here is that with my queen on a1, it's actually a really nice vision of chess geometry. The queen is challenging its black counterpart in f6, controlling the d4 square, which was a weakness a moment ago. Queen d4 check might have been an idea, and simultaneously challenges the bishop on a8. So, and the a file is really the one open file in the position. So amazingly, all of a sudden, I've managed to get a few exchanges and control the one open file, and all of a sudden, the position is slightly better for white. So it's amazing how just a few little moves, a few changes in pawn structure can just drastically change the evaluation. So anyways, after queen a1, black castled, and now I actually went queen takes f6, trading this queen just to replace it with my rook on a1. So after g takes f6, which I thought was a little bit suspect, to be honest, because now the h7 pawn becomes weak, but I understand why g takes f6 was played to get more coverage in the center, but I thought it might be a little bit risky. Knight takes f6 was also an option. But anyways, after g takes f6, I went rook a1, and now it's quite clear that white is better. I have the open A file, this b4 pawn that was a strength earlier, limiting my b3 and c2 pawns, particularly the backward c pawn, is now a potential weakness. And this bishop on g2 is much better than its counterpart on a8, because in many lines, the bishop on a8 is unprotected, and that means that the d pawn will be pinned. So this actually really, really helps me out. So after rook a1, black played bishop b7, trying to step off that diagonal. One of the immediate threats in the position was actually sometimes to play f5, and actually something with rook takes a8 and bishop takes d5 check could sometimes skewer a black rook on a8 with a black king on g8. So that was potential in the position. But after bishop b7, I now went rook a7, again activating this rook, maximizing my activity on the a file, and really stopping black from playing rook a8, which was a potential move with the rook on a1 a move ago. So rook a7 stops that and hits the bishop on b7. Now black played knight c5. Not the best move. Slightly better would have been rook b8, but even in this position, white is for choice. I have a move like f5, for instance, and again, e takes f5 is impossible because rook takes b7 picks up material. So even here, white would be better, but knight c5 was played, and I think the idea with knight c5 was to play rook a8 next and kick the rook off of the a file. And that's why it's very important here that I play the move rook a5, because in this position now, I ensure that the rooks stay on the board and I keep my endgame pressure on the queen side. Whereas if I played like a slow move like king f2, the rooks would get traded after rook a8, and this position is really not that much better for white. Black can hold this one. So anyways, after knight c5, rook a5, black now played knight a6, but this is an extremely, extremely awkward move to make. Now, he was trying to cover the b4 pawn, so if the knight goes anywhere else, let's say knight d7, rook b5 is an idea in a lot of positions. So that is understandable, but knight a6 just twists black's pieces into a pretzel, and it just becomes extremely unpleasant. And now I'm actually able to break through with the very, very important looking f5. And the point is that e takes f5 really ruins black's pawn structure even further and gets at the d5 pawn, which is a really, really important target. So if e takes f5 here, now after bishop takes d5 check, bishop takes and rook takes, the material is equal, but black has a world of pain coming to him because the knight on a6 is very weak, the f5 pawn is already a target, and the b4 pawn might be a little bit weak as well. And now that the d5 pawn is gone, my knight actually has a wonderful outpost on c4 to anchor itself on. So very, very unpleasant position for black. So after f5, it's really, really tough sledding, and here Ruben actually played king f7, trying to defend the pawn like so, with the idea to step up with the king to e6. But now actually continue the undermining process with the move e4. And the point is that the structure is actually just collapsing, and then what winds up happening is that my bishop on g2 becomes a serious factor because the bishop on b7 in many lines is extremely, extremely weak because it's not protected by anything and it's guarding the knight on a6. So all of a sudden, the position is actually pretty much close to winning because of this undermining and because black is kind of twisted into a pretzel here. Now, c6 was played trying to shore up the d5 pawn, but just to illustrate, if a move like e takes f5 is played, I actually have two really attractive options, but the one I like is actually e takes d5. And again, the material is equal, but you can see these pawns are very weak on the king side, and my knight's coming to c4 where it's going to be very active. And the king can't even, on f7, can't even mobilize because if you go king e7, d6 check wins on the spot tactically because the bishop on b7 is hanging. So again, we see this element of the bishop on b7 being unprotected, being the much weaker bishop on that diagonal. And that actually happens a lot with bishops opposing each other on the same diagonal. A lot of times you have to ask yourself which one is protected, because usually the one that's actually hanging is tactically vulnerable to discoveries. So anyways, after e4, c6, I now decide to take on e6 because I saw here that I can basically secure a really nice advantage with my rook coming to b5. So after f takes e6 check, king takes, and then e takes d5, c takes d5, now rook b5 is extremely important. And the material is equal, but you can see black has 4 pawn islands. That's as more pawn islands than you can. That's as many pawn islands as you can have in any chess position is 4, and so that's quite unfortunate. And I, on the other hand, have 2 pawn islands, so my pawn structure is much better. And again, this bishop on b7 is very weak. The knight on a6 is dominated, and black's pawns are just totally dropping. Rook b8 was played, trying to protect the bishop on b7. And now I just went rook b6 check, further encroaching to the black position and just making the king make a very, very difficult decision because it really, doesn't want to come up the board. But if it goes back, then f6 might be a target as well. King e7 was played, and now I went bishop f1. And now the point is the job is done on this diagonal. I've created a target on d5. Now I'm challenging the knight on a6 so that I can just win the b4 pawn. And once I collect one of these pawns, it's going to be very, very difficult to hold because then even exchanges are favorable for me. So now after knight c5, I just played rook takes b4, and the position is just lost because with d5, f6, and h7 all being weak, isolated pawns, it's just a matter of time for me to mop up and collect some of these weaknesses. So the game would last actually quite a while from here, but it's actually just a matter of technique because black is simply so tied down in this position. Black played rook c8, getting the rook off of the pin and saying that as long as the knight's on c5, the bishop on b7 is protected. I now went rook h4, though, attacking the h7 pawn, and also entertaining b4 in certain positions. And now my rook is actually shifting from side to side, just creating little problems for black to solve because of the nature of his structure. Rook h8 was played, a very, very passive-looking move, but unfortunately necessary if you want to cover the h-pawn. And now I went bishop g2 back, shifting my bishop away from the diagonal where it was, challenging the knight on a6 because it's actually moved, and now just shifting it back towards the h1 a8 diagonal because, again, the bishop on g2 is more secure than the one on b7. After bishop g2, black went king d6. And now I went rook h6, attacking the f6 pawn. And then after knight d7, I went bishop h3, attacking the d7 knight. So I'm basically just trying to win a second pawn. Black went bishop c8. And now I actually went king f2. You might ask, why didn't I take the knight on d7 and win the second pawn? I actually thought black could get some play in the position just because I wasn't totally coordinated. So I thought it would be a little bit smarter, instead of, being a pawn grubber and trying to get that second pawn, just to maximize the utility of my pieces before I went in for more material. So after king f2, king e7 was played, trying to defend that pawn now. And I went knight f3, and you can see here, I'm just slowly creeping up the board with my pieces, centralizing a little bit more. And again, these pawns aren't really going anywhere, and trades are actually favorable for me, so I just didn't want to allow any counterplay. Now knight e5 was played, and I actually took on c8, and after rook takes c8, just went rook takes h7 check, and actually got my second pawn. And so this is another thing that happens sometimes in games, is like, essentially, your opponent is defending and it's super unpleasant, and they just get tired of defending and they want to play actively, and then you actually win a little bit faster. So that's the other benefit of being patient, because now, this one is definitely technically winning 2 pawns up. So after rook h7, king d6, knight d4 to cover c2, and now knight c6 was played. I guess trying to challenge this knight on d4. Really, I could have thought about taking on c6, but I thought knight f5 check was a little bit more effective, because I thought if knight takes c6, rook takes c6, black will get one of the pawns back, and I just didn't want to allow this type of counterplay. So instead, I went knight f5 check, and after king e5, I actually went rook h5, now entertaining discoveries with knight e7. A slightly better move would have actually been knight e7 check right away. And what I missed here actually, or it's not check, but what I missed here is that after this fork and the rooks come off the board, I was worried about king d4 and the king running to c3 and securing this pawn, and then all of a sudden the d pawn running. But actually in this position, I actually just have to move rook e2. And the problem is that after king c3, I can actually just start running my own h pawn, and black is simply not in time to try and secure the c2 pawn, because the d4 pawn would be hanging. And so this would actually be a trade that would be extremely favorable for me. And with the king being so far away from the queen side, there's just no way to save this game. So yeah, this would have been something that be a much, much easier technical task. But for some reason, I think really I missed the move king f3. And this is an important move in this variation, because now when the rook comes to d2, I actually not forced to trade the rooks. I can actually take the d4 pawn. So that's actually kind of important. So basically the game went on a little bit longer than it needed to, because I missed this knight e7 move, but it didn't spoil anything. So after rook h5, black went king e6 back, and now I went king e3, centralizing further. And after knight e5, I went knight d4 check again. And after king f7, I went king d2, just overprotecting c2 and getting ready to move my rook somewhere. After king g6, I went rook f5. And then after rook h8, h4. And now I'm starting to go forward a little bit. I'm 2 pawns up. My knight on d4 is very centralized. My rook on f5 is good. Now I feel much, much better about pushing my pawns. After king f7, I went knight e2, just overprotecting g3 now, because I thought rook g8 might be an idea. And after king e6, rook f4. And now the point is my rook might shift over to the queen side perhaps and check from the other side, but I've shored up my pawns on this side of the board. I can think about pushing my b pawn. I can think about pushing my h pawn. I have quite a few options. Rook g8 was played, and now I actually went for rook a4, teasing a rook a6 check. But after king f5 and rook a5, king e4, I thought, you know what? I don't like this king being this active, so I actually went back to a4 with check. And after king f5, I wound up going rook f4 just to keep the king boxed in on the 6th rank. And now after king e6, I actually said, you know what? I can push my pawns, and went for the move h5. Because basically what I realized is that even if I lose the h pawn in some variations, as long as pieces come off the board, if rooks get traded or knights get traded, because I also have the b pawn, it's actually completely winning. So I'm actually comfortable even losing a pawn if it means that it facilitates a trade of pieces. So this is something that I was also angling for at this point, because he was actually kind of defending fairly stubbornly, and I just was like, you know what, this game should be over. So after h5, black went rook g5, and now I actually went rook f1. Basically, I wanted to go rook h4, but knight f3 check would have been a nasty fork, so I have to go to h1 to support the pawn. And fortunately for me, rook takes h5 is not possible because I have a fork of my own with knight f4 check. So after rook f1, black went knight f7, and now I went knight f4 check, because what I realized now is that if I go rook h1, now knight h6 just blockades the pawn, and that was kind of a bit frustrating for me to see. So I decided to play knight f4 check. And now after king d6, I went knight g6, and I'm hitting the f6 pawn. After king e6, I went knight f8 check, climbing up the ladder, so to speak. But really the point here is that if king e5, I have knight d7, forking the king on e5 and the pawn on f6. And after king e7, which was played, I have knight h7, and I'm facilitating some trades. And again, any trades are good for me, so it's something that I'm kind of comfortable with. And so after knight h7, rook takes h5, and knight takes f6, I managed to trade a pawn and keep my advantage. So this was something that's quite reasonable for me. After rook h2 check, now I went king c1 just to back up and get out of the checks. And now I realize the game's probably going to come to a close because knight takes d5 is a legitimate threat. You can't really defend that pawn super well because the knight on f7 is also hanging. And so unfortunately for black actually did play king e6, and he actually just missed that knight takes d5 wins material because the knight on f7 is actually hanging. And again, trades are good for me. So, winning a pawn and also trading is perfect, and getting to a rook endgame 3 pawns up is easily winning. So after knight takes d5, I actually expected him to resign, but he actually played king takes d5. And here, actually, on my move, before I could play rook takes f7, he actually resigned the game. Interesting game for me. I hadn't faced this particular, anti-Catalan type of setup with b5 before, and I didn't really react well to it. I think black had a reasonable position, and at the end of the day, I think I just was a little bit stronger than him chess-wise, and that kind of won the day rather than any particular opening advantage. But I'll take it. It was nice to get a win, and particularly after, a slow start with half point out of 2, I was happy with it. I was happy to get on the board. That being said, this tournament, frankly, would prove to be one I really was shaky in throughout. And you can even see here in my win that the game was not a particularly clean one. That's, my games typically, when I'm playing at my best, I show much, much better technique than I showed here. So it is what it is, but, you take it and you move on. You live to fight another day. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.